Our guest with us today is Dr. Burt Folsom, who is the Charles F. Klein Professor of History and Management at Hillsdale College. Dr. Folsom, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Derek. Good to be here.
We appreciate having you here. You're the author of several books. You've written on The Myth of the Robber Barons,
Yes.
The New Deal or Raw Deal, and FDR Goes to War. All of your books seem to have a common theme of re-examining history. Could you describe for our listeners why it's important to get that historical narrative correct?
That's a good question, Derek, because if we don't get the historical narrative correct, we won't get present public policy correct. The poor historical narrative leads to poor public policy. Poor public policy leads to impoverishment and decline. So we have to get the history right in order to give us a framework to develop good public policy. People have axes to grind and also you just get superficial writings that go on, and sometimes we have to re-examine these periods. I do the period of the late 1800s, the rise of the United States to be a world power. That's in the book, The Myth of the Robber Barons. And then the period of the New Deal, the 1930s, which you mentioned, because those are the two periods that perhaps historians, at least economic historians, have failed to deliver good advice or good description of what happened. When you have the rise of the United States from being a second-rate power to being a first-rate power, it's a story of triumph. So it's odd that we sometimes call it the robber baron era, because these are the people who gave us competitive products at low prices. That seems to me odd. Rockefeller, you start with oil, it was $1 a gallon when he came in, he gets it to 8 cents a gallon. Carnegie and steel, when steel and the British were making it at over $50 a ton, Carnegie got the price down to $11 a ton, and thus made the United States the center of the world for steel production and oil production, which of course is going to pave the way for Henry Ford in the next century. So it's a story of triumph, and it's a story of triumph occurring in free markets with good property rights, good legal framework, protection of contracts, the Constitution working well, markets working well. And so I think that's the story that needs to be told. The misconceptions in the era, you say, how did we get it wrong? The popular perception of the era was driven by Matthew Josephson's book, The Robber Barons. And Josephson was a Marxist of sorts. When the book came out, in fact, he was in Russia with Stalin, praising the Russians for the way they were handling their economy. He called Stalin a statesman and an expert on economic development, and said he hated to live in the United States where he could not connect with our culture as much as he could when he was over in Russia. Well, his book, The Robber Barons, was very critical, and people have picked up on the criticism of these businessmen, and instead of focusing on their long-range accomplishments. For example, Cornelius Vanderbilt was in some ways personally kind of a repugnant person. He had his wife committed to an asylum and this sort of thing. He disinherited some of his children. But if you look at the focus on the markets, he always was reducing prices and producing a good product in transportation, either with steamships or the New York Central Railroad, a good product for customers. If we focus on the market rather than personal peccadillos, we end up arriving at a conclusion that, hey, markets work. The United States rose to be a prominent nation on the basis of good public policy and extending freedom to entrepreneurs to produce good products.
So the notion of robber barons is really a misnomer because
Yes.
they weren't robbing people, it was creating these win-wins then.
Exactly. It was a win-win not only for the entrepreneurs, but for the customers who were getting good and new products that they didn't have access to before.
Wow, that's wonderful. Now, I also know you make this distinction between a market entrepreneur and a political
Correct.
entrepreneur. Could you explain for our listeners who are probably thinking, entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs, what's the difference between the two?
Right. It's a distinction I made because there's a sense in which the criticism of the entrepreneurs in the late 1800s is valid, I discovered. It is right. But it's because there was a group of these businessmen who sought and took federal aid. And when that happened, it distorted the market and it made for bad economic results. The Union Pacific, for example, took federal aid to build the railroads. They failed. We see Edward Collins taking subsidies from the federal government to operate a steamship line. It failed. And what I found was interesting is the private competitors James J. Hill in the case of the transcontinentals, Cornelius Vanderbilt in the case of the steamships, both succeeded by trying to produce a very good product at competitive prices, competing against operations that were federally subsidized. The subsidies distorted the economy for those who received the subsidies, so that they ended up relying on subsidies instead of trying to innovate, produce a good product for consumers.
So instead they try to make the politicians happy as opposed to making consumers happy.
Exactly. I call the ones that compete in a marketplace for good products at competitive prices, I call them the market entrepreneurs. The ones trying to win and succeed by seeking federal aid and operating on the basis of federal aid, I call them political entrepreneurs. The political entrepreneurs are the robber barons. The market entrepreneurs are those people who allowed the United States to rise to being a world-class economic power.
Wonderful. If there was one thing you could leave our listeners with the importance of history and understanding economic history in particular, what's that one lesson that you could leave them with?
The one lesson I would leave is that if we trust in people rather than trusting in government, that we'll get more of what we want, we'll get it at a better price, and we'll have lower taxes.
Dr. Folsom, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.